Hannah and I are doing a bit of a double act on this one. We'll try and keep it sort of fairly light, fast moving, because I think it's that really difficult time of the day where everyone's kind of like, oh, really? People are talking to me again? So anyway, I'm effectively moderating. I'm Dr. Sophie Taysom. I am founder and director at Kia Consulting. So I work with companies across the built environment on ESG. I do a variety of other things, but if you haven't already and you're interested in the ESG, a few years ago on LinkedIn I set up the ESG in Real Estate Group, which I think within the next couple of days should hit 4,000 members. So do feel free to join it. Very excited.
Thousands since we last
Yes,
did a
very
presentation.
much
So,
so.
yeah.
Getting quite crazy in terms of numbers. So today we are talking about the infamous G of ESG. So this really builds on previous presentations that Hannah and I have done to UKAA, talking about both environmental considerations as well as social considerations. So the aim is really, we're beginning with a number of assumptions that you've got a sense of what ESG is, that you're probably working with some sort of underpinning strategy, but it's that how do you actually realize this, how do you then operationalize. So that's really the focus of today's conversation on the G part of that. But first, I would like to we've got sort of 20, 25 minutes. We'll try and give you some time for questions and things. For our lovely panelists, if you could first introduce yourself, say a little bit about your role, and also I'd be really interested in hearing about how you and your company, because you all come from very different perspectives, have gone about developing and embedding governance considerations as it relates to ESG. So that can either be governance around or governance of ESG. So.
Great, thanks. Hi, Todd Marler. I'm the Senior Director of Operations for our multifamily build-to-rent portfolio in the UK and Ireland. So really everything that has to do with how we're going to operate our assets from beginning to whenever we offboard them sits under my remit. And so to answer your question about how Greystar has approached the governance, I know you're going to ask a question later on kind of about how things have progressed and changed, but I definitely would say, one of the things that Greystar has done of recent is really understanding the need to have dedicated people who are supporting that. And so we've hired specific roles, Director of ESG, that really helps us think about governance and how we approach that and how we have transparency around that, but not only just within Greystar at a corporate level, but really then at each entity level, because that becomes part of the challenge, right? And then on top of that is how do we make sure that we're embedding and understanding each of our investors' ESG strategies and their governance, because that also then has to get incorporated into what it is we're doing, right? So it gets quite complicated when you think about the ownership structures and the various people that touch real estate. When you start thinking about how are you going to ensure that you've got the right kind of governance in place, how are you going to have the transparency around that governance, and then how are you going to make sure that it's aligned with all the various partners that you touch, because it's not just Greystar is really part of that challenge. So I think that's how we approach it, and I think to be totally transparent, I would say in the last 2 years we've made huge progress in really, I think, coming to a place where we can be proud of what it is that we're doing and the governances that we now have in place.
Hi everyone, I'm Louise Mangy. I am the Director of Build to Rent for Urban Bubble, who is a third-party operator in residential leasehold, BTR and co-live. The business was started in 2008 in a bedroom, so we've gone a big whole period of time, a bedroom to the business that we are today, and that I think is shown in our ESG journey. For us it's very much about kind of why we're doing things, what's the governance and why we're measuring it, what it is that we're actually looking at doing, and how does that relate to us as a business, as Urban Bubble, and again, as Todd has just said, how does that align with the clients that we're working with and ensure that we've got that synergy there. And I think from a business that has grown in that way, in terms of our change, it's been very much like, I don't imagine that ESG was forefront of mind in the bedroom when the business was first started. I think there were other things there. And as we've grown and as we've got bigger, then we've done an awful lot of things that I don't think we necessarily kind of thought about as ESG. And now as we've got bigger, we're going, okay, well, actually we do a lot of this, but how do we get that data? Where do we record it? And how do we tell people that story? And I would say certainly within the last year we've grown massively in doing that, but we are really trying to kind of put together what that entirety looks like in terms of what do we do today, where do we want to be tomorrow, and what does our journey look like?
Hi everyone, I'm Andy from Harrison Brands. Harrison Brands is a design and branding agency that started 3 years ago. March this year we achieved B Corp certification. This is important to us because when we started the business, we wanted to have a framework from which we could build a business that meant it could grow successfully. And the impact assessment that we filled in whilst applying for the B Corp certification instructed us exactly what we should be putting in place for the future. So that enabled us to do things like looking outside of the business to who we can speak to get advice, engaging with other stakeholders, employing people like the non-exec directors that are helping us. So that's talking to people outside of the business, and that is a fundamental part of governance. So yeah, we've got that in place now. What we're doing is we're helping other organisations to communicate their sustainability credentials effectively. There is a big problem, I think, with everyone's measuring the data, but how do they communicate that to their stakeholders? And that needs to be in a clear, concise, engaging communication form. So that's how we're helping people, and that is what Harrison Brands does.
Great. Hi, I'm Hannah Durden. I run a sustainable development consultancy called Carbon Neutral Zero Waste Developments. It hopefully does what it says on the tin. In terms of developing and embedding the G element, I think it comes back to, I set up the business, I founded it 3 or 4 years ago, and it comes back to my personal values, but that then relates to the culture of the business. And we do quite a lot with clients around, even before we've written their ESG strategy or started to engage on that process, we'll actually sit back, look at their brands, look at their culture, and work with a culture canvas which starts to say, well, what are you about? What's your brand about? And then I think relating to some of the things that you guys have touched on, look at what the company is already doing really well, and then starting to think about how they communicate that. So it's a brand and culture piece, which then feeds down into all the good stuff that they're doing across ES and ultimately G as well.
Great, thank you. Todd, picking up on the point you said about needing dedicated resource around that governance piece. So I'm assuming in the audience we're going to have a bit of a mix from potentially quite small operations to very, very sizable operations. So any perspectives from panel members about how you kind of get the governance right? I have my own views, but
I do think that probably a mistake that many companies of any size make is to think that ESG is going to be a side job of another person, or it's going to be a committee of people who are going to be able to drive that forward. It isn't that simple, right? It's quite complex. And to really have a strategy that's well thought out, that understands the business's needs and really starts to build that out in a very robust way, you need to have dedicated resources to it. And again, it doesn't matter the size of the organization, but it needs to be a dedicated role that's specifically designed to help build that out. And so, the governance actually is probably the place you should start, but it is just so important. Governance exists already, it always exists in all these companies, but how are we then communicating that? Are we being transparent about it? How are we making sure that we're reviewing it on a regular basis? And in order to do that, you just have to have dedicated resource. So to me, that's the starting point.
Hannah, what are you finding in some of your conversations with that?
Yeah, I mean, resource is a big thing, and it's resource in terms of internal people, and I think also time, giving people the time and headspace to do it. I mean, I think the biggest problem I've seen, and this was with a 500-person strong consultancy, was that they were running timesheets. They're supposed to be billing 120% of their 8 hours a day, and they were just overwhelmed and saying, we don't have time to dedicate to upskilling, to understanding how we've got to change, how we might travel to a site, how we perhaps think of our emissions in relation to the work we're doing. So I think, resource in terms of people and skills, but resource in terms of giving those people the time and headspace and budgets as well. I feel that a lot of companies think, we'll just write an ESG strategy. We don't need any extra time or people or skill sets to do this. So I think making sure that you're giving people the time and headspace is pretty key.
And even resource in terms of the software and how are you going to track it and what systems are you going to use and implement.
Yeah.
It's not cheap to do all those things, but it's really important. So it's all of that resource.
I would totally agree on that, just from the point of, even when you start doing it, it's like, where do I get it from? Where do I put it? How do I visualise it? Therefore, how can I tell that story from it? And I think the other piece is whether you've got a dedicated resource or not. It's a bit like a health and safety piece. Health and safety, ESG belongs to everybody, and it's about getting that in the mindset that everybody in your business, that this is something that we're all about. So when we were first setting some of our goals, and we were looking at which of the UN goals to work with, we went out to the entire business to vote on and give everybody a say of these are the things that we really want to focus on, get the buy-in early and start moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's brand behaviour. Yeah, it has to, you can't just have one person pulling forward. It has to be the behaviour of everybody, realising why they're doing this and what they need to do to improve.
And I think comms, internal comms as well, from a G perspective, we're saying, yes, this is our ESG strategy, but what does that actually mean to everybody on the ground? And how do you communicate that stakeholders internally and externally as well, which is then probably what you're more involved in.
Which of course brings me perfectly to my next question, which is really around how do you navigate that cultural shift? So certainly in a lot of conversations I've had with clients or other conversations, it's been like, actually this has been a real struggle, because in terms of communicating the ESG piece, it's not just the nice shiny. It's sometimes you need to communicate the good, the bad, the ugly. Because if you don't, you're failing to communicate material risks, right? So it does require potentially a bit of a mind sort of shift. How have you negotiated, if you've needed to negotiate that? I presume to some extent sort of the urban bubble, it just would have kind of bubbled up, it would have grown, and so that was really bad.
We use bubble in a lot of things. Don't worry about that. Yes, it kind of bubbled up, and then we started to go, can I explain to people that we work with and to the teams how much they are actually doing? And I think that you've got to, as I said, start somewhere. We're going to have a set that we're going to measure, and I think the second thing is it does fit into those culture and values. And I think as we have grown, we've been very honest about kind of what we've done well and what we haven't done well, and always taken that piece of you've got to fail to succeed. So this is, at least we've had a go, so if we fail, that's fine. We just make a new mistake next time, and then we learn from it and we grow and move forward. So that's the only way that really we're going to grow where we are today to where we want to be tomorrow from an ESG perspective. And as long as we're being open, honest, transparent, asking the right questions, and doing things for the right reasons, then I think we'll do it right.
I was just going to say, I mean, for Grace, I think one of our challenges in terms of any of these cultural shifts is our scale is the opposite, right? So when you think about across the globe, and the US is a very massive part of our business, obviously, it becomes challenging when you have to make kind of these major cultural shifts. And I think the way that you do it, the way that Grace attempts to do it, or is doing it, is by making sure you're really documenting things so that you can communicate effectively, and there's a clear strategy that is in locations that people have access to, and then it is a part of the conversations that you have on a regular basis. It's part of, everybody's goal setting. It's part of saying, what is our strategy? What is it that we're trying to do? How are we going to implement that? And how am I, in whatever role I'm in, going to be a part of that?
Yeah.
And I think you just have to work extra hard, and especially like they said, in an organization of our scale, you just have to work extra hard to make sure it's really well documented and that it's very accessible to people, because there's just so much data and information out there, and it can be quite difficult.
And Andy, what about for your own business?
Well, it was all about finding out how transparency is a key part of it.
Yeah.
So, the financial performance, for example, is something that people are quite scared of sharing with other people. But we don't live in that world anymore. We need to have complete transparency. That way, the truth comes out.
Yeah.
Now, the truth builds trust. And if you start with truth and you act on the truthful intentions, and you have transparency, it's going to build, a better brand, really.
And I think don't be afraid to influence people, whether that is your occupiers in BTR or your staff. I mean, two great examples. British Land, I know their development team, their bonuses are directly linked to their CO2, so embodied carbon of their developments. And actually a great example of a lady that was speaking about Speedy Hire the other day. All their vehicles are tracked, and their drivers receive financial bonuses based on how they drive those vehicles. And that's looking at whether they're braking excessively, accelerating excessively, so they are influencing them in that way. And I think the nudge, this sort of idea of nudging people to switch lights off or use less water, or in that BTR space in terms of the occupier, I think is really fascinating, and that can really come down from G in terms of your staff and your occupiers.
Great. Before we go to questions, one last question. I do have some other questions in case you guys don't. You can have some questions. So if you could recommend sort of one or two places, so for people here who might be sort of relatively early stages thinking about how they might effectively kind of dedicate resource, how they might communicate, how they might address some of those kind of new, emerging, forthcoming, quite big kind of governance, compliance issues that are coming down the line, particularly from the EU with the corporate sustainability disclosure regulations and these sorts of things. Where should people start?
Do you want me to kick off?
Yeah.
I think the key one is don't set a target if you don't know your baseline. I've seen this so much over the last 2-3 years. And we've got this net zero target of 2040. I'm like, all right, so when did you measure baseline? Oh, no, we haven't done that yet. So, and that's coming from the G. That is boards, directors not understanding what they're doing, probably not with the speciality resource at board level, and being like, oh, we're net zero by 2040. And that's across the board. It's not just carbon emissions, and you can get carbon myopia. So I think, don't set targets if you don't understand your baseline is the key one. So measure data. Yeah. Just keep collecting data and go from there.
Fantastic.
I would say start by looking at what data you have got today. Think about an impact report and what you would put into that impact report. And the important thing is then do it the next year, and then the next year, and the next year. And that way you're looking at improving each year. Because if you don't start today, it's going to be too late later on.
Yeah, so certainly my big message with all my clients and all my conversations is just, if you haven't started already, start somewhere. You've got to get sort of the data, the metrics, the baselines sorted, because the greater the legacy you've got, the greater the trust there will be in the figures.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about it to be your business planning, right? So you have to start somewhere. So if you have nothing, then you've got to start with doing exactly what you said. Let's look at what we have, what information do we have, what policies, procedures do we have, how are we going to communicate these things? And just, you start there, but then on top of that, I think the next step to me would be think about what are the benchmarks. So where's your end goal, but then what are those benchmarks that you're going to be working towards, and make them steps that are realistic steps that you can actually achieve. So don't say we're going to have this whole ESG policy done in the next 3 months for every single asset and for the corporate office, and for that's just not achievable. But if we start by saying, okay, we're going to gather all the data by the end of the next quarter, what data are you going to gather? So I think it's just about making sure you got the right kind of benchmarks, so that you know what you're working towards, so you can get to that end goal. We all have to start somewhere, and really ESG is a fairly new concept in the way that we're looking at it today, right? And so all of us are chasing. None of us have it together. Like, we're all looking for data, and we have older buildings that we don't have data on that we should have data on, and so you have to start collecting it from today, right? New buildings, now we have to start thinking about what technology are we using, what are we going to do to make sure we're measuring things appropriately. So I think we're all kind of in that same boat to some degree.
And a great point about having those benchmarks. I'm a bit strange. I actually read ESG reports. And what I love is when companies have sort of made a commitment by this quarter we'll have done this, and you actually read in the report, we failed. We didn't do this. This is why we're either changing track or we'll devote a bit more attention, or you know what, the economy, COVID, whatever got in the way. And it's all kind of very coherent, very sensible reasons, but it is about that sort of communicating the good, the bad, the ugly. Sorry, Louise.
Most people kind of stole what I was going to say, which was totally understand what you're doing today and doing well. Set yourself some targets, because there are a million different KPIs you can use under E, S and G. So don't try and do all of them all at once. Set your journey up for something that you can do realistically and involve everybody.
And I'm going to go back to the thing that I started with, but the last thing is you decide what the dedicated resource is going to be, and decide as an organization that you're going to dedicate resource to it and how much resource you're going to dedicate. But make sure you do that, because if you don't, as we've just talked about, it just becomes too difficult. You have to have some dedicated resource to it.
Yeah, and I think don't underestimate also some genuine fear. We say that ESG is a new thing. Someone put their hand up the other morning and said, isn't this just all common sense? And I think empowering people to realise, A, that as a company and as an individual you're probably doing some quite good stuff anyway, so start with what you're doing well, but also to empower people to realise it's not rocket science and that everybody can do it and be involved in it, and that comes back to the internal comms thing.
I mean, part of the fun I have with clients is almost like taking them from that position of fear of, oh my God, this is overwhelming and it's moving so quickly and there's so much data, to, oh, we're already doing all of this and we could do better on that. But great, we've actually got a plan. We know how to get there.
And Sophie, we don't need you anymore.
That's
the aim.
Yeah, I love doing myself out of a job. There's nothing better, which is why I'm a consultant. That's my plan. Anyway, we're going to open the floor to questions. So if you could say who you are, and just if you could keep any questions nice and short and sharp, that would be great. Yep.
Ladies first.
We're matching in terms of colours.
Yeah, very fitting, three of us.
Yeah.
Hi, Lizzie Pennant, Goodstone Living, ex-Greystar for transparency. Given we're talking about ESG and governance. I'm General Counsel, so also quite keen on the G in ESG and feel like it's quite often ignored, so really appreciate you guys having this panel. You've talked about obviously the governance within your organisation and how that kind of interacts with your stakeholders, the capital stack, investors, lenders, etc. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how the governance relates to kind of your supply chain, essentially, so kind of further down the chain in your structure. I'm in the process of writing our supply chain charter at the moment, frankly, and struggling with how you hit that balance between making sure you're maintaining the highest standards and transparency with your suppliers, but also not closing out, say, small and medium-sized enterprises, which actually the local businesses that we want to engage for our social value strategy, how you kind of strike that balance and how far you can go in terms of putting demands on your supply chain in terms of recording their carbon emissions, for example, to help you with your reporting.
Absolutely.
Without making it all too burdensome. If you've got any practical tips, I'd be grateful.
Just to say, absolutely brilliant question. It's something I keep banging on about. In terms of supply chains, A, how do you get it right? And B, how do you sort of assure that your due diligence for suppliers is appropriate but not exclusive, particularly say to social enterprises, SMEs, smaller sort of local businesses. Over to you.
I think from my perspective, that fits down to the culture and the values that you're going to push both through your business and down when you're working with any kind of third party. So you're bringing on a third party who's then going to subcontract, then you've got to take that a step further, and you need to make sure you go down the chain so that we can stand there in a very good way and go, we are really comfortable with the people we employ, whether we employ them directly or whether we employ them through a third party.
I think from my perspective, when you're doing kind of your agreements with your contractors, I think a framework agreement for certain large-scale supply chain makes sense. Big agreements that you have with whoever are doing a lot of business or bigger companies. But you have to have a certain amount of flexibility too. I think it's not one size fits all, or otherwise you'll do exactly what you just said. You also exclude so many people who could actually benefit from working for you. And it's that local supplier, which actually is the right thing to do for the local communities that we're working in, but for many of them it becomes too onerous or difficult to really be compliant. Yet you still want to make sure that they're hitting your cultural requirements and your ESG requirements. And so I think not making it one size fits all and almost have several kind of contractual agreements, and also based on the type of contractor it is and the risks that they have, because not all suppliers do the same things or bring in the same. And so if they've got a lot of employees or a lot of potential third, parties that they use, that's a different kind of contracting relationship than somebody who's just supplying you with certain goods. Even though you still need to know where they're coming from, how that process works. But if that makes sense, the flexibility I think is important.
And also know your suppliers as well. That is data. So start recording that data down so that you can work towards targets. And then when you find out what your targets are you trying to deal with people that are locally? Do you want to serve underserved parts of the community? It's all of that. And you can reach those targets once you've got a starting point.
Yeah, know what percentage of your supply chain are SMEs and may not have the ability to cope. I mean, I always say to clients, certainly more SME clients, ask the question, and then I think actually collaborate as well. I was really impressed by Canary Wharf Group. They had, I think their target is that 60% of their supply chain must have signed up to a science-based target by 2025. Again, I'm going back to carbon emissions, but I was really impressed by all the collaboration that they were doing and actually upskilling and training of their supply chain and inviting people into forums like this and getting people to come and sit and sort of say what best practice was and what their expectations were of the supply chain. And I think trying to work with them as opposed to just being like, this is what's going to happen, really appreciating that they wanted to keep those relationships going.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Chris Holmes from Matica Black. Sort of extension, I suppose, to that question, but rather than looking down the supply chain, I wonder whether or not the governance that you're putting in place and the processes through people that aren't necessarily timesheet bound or could be argued to be a professional overhead. Are you seeing that benefit your customers? Are you seeing actually something back from the processes you're putting in place?
Well, I'm looking at you. You've got the key people in place.
I can give you the theory, I don't know what's actually happening on the ground. So, yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, there has to be a benefit, right, to it. And I think, again, it's around if you've got clear governance that's really transparent and you're able to, and you're not afraid to share that information, then it absolutely has benefits. And I think that's probably the biggest piece, is that transparency, the true transparency. And some of the stuff that we know are reporting on or have to be reporting on, but then even are reporting on because it has implications on valuations of our assets and all these other things, that's good. That allows us to understand how do we need to help support either our suppliers or others to be better. And we're being very clear about where we're missing targets and where we are hitting targets and what our targets are going to be. And before none of that really existed. So to me, the part of governance that's so important is that transparency. And with transparency comes change, and we get better.
And I think there is something quite interesting about that customer point in terms of the end customer. If you're thinking about the resident, won't necessarily care about a lot of this stuff. That it's not that. Why would they care about so much of this stuff? Where they will care is where things go wrong. So if I think ESG is fundamentally seen as a risk management kind of framework and way to kind of think about how you manage and think through the material risks and issues, then it's, you do it because it makes things run effectively, smoothly, openly.
As much as we don't have a dedicated resource, I'll say yet. In order to tell your story to the truest way, you're going to need some time to be spent in that. So, and most of us don't have people with capacity that can go and do that. And they can tell us all the good stuff they're doing, but someone does need to pull it all together. And I absolutely see there is value to that story being out there for many people, whether that be investors or residents or your own team.
I should imagine there is a killer stat somewhere about demand. I mean, you're saying people don't care about it, but I think increasingly people do care about the environment they're living in, their air quality, weather, water quality, etc. So, I think from a demand perspective and a talent retention perspective, all the people that you're employing to deliver these wonderful buildings that generate the rental income. I think that talent war to be seen at a G level that you are doing the right thing is really important.
And I think our investors care. We know that banks care now. Like I said, valuation.
Yes.
I think when we're selling assets, it will have an impact on it. And I think our residents do care. I mean, we survey residents, and they care about not just what we're doing for the environment, but they want to know what we're doing for the communities and how we're incorporating that. So they care about that piece. And they absolutely care, about our policies and procedures and what we stand for as an organization. And I think people are now, and especially as generations continue to come up, I mean, they want a lot of information. They want to know what they're putting their money into. And so, and the same thing, whether it's the employees, whether it's the investors, or whether it's our residents, it touches everybody. So if companies don't take the time to start thinking about it now, they're really shooting themselves in the foot, because it's just an essential part of what it is to be in business today. It's not a nice to have, it's an absolute must have. And you've got to have governance, and you've got to have process, and you've got to have transparency. Like it has to be there.
Well, and coming back to what Andy said earlier, like also the biggest thing for G for me, I would say to everybody, don't be afraid to say that you're making a profit, because you are not making money. You're not going to reinvest this money into the good S and E stuff that's going on. And I like that, G and compliance and the finance piece and legal piece as well. If you're not making money, then I'm afraid it does come back to money and being a solvent, sustainable business. So.
Precisely.
Or as simple as telling the truth and being transparent. You'll be respected for it.
Exactly. And on those points, we have to love you and leave you, so you can head off to your next sessions or hang around and have a chat, whatever you like. If you'd like to put your hands together, thank you.
Thank you. Hiya, how you doing? Right, you?
I was like, this suits me, but then everyone came in and I was like, okay. Yeah, it's a bit more like it's like that. I was like, oh my god, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, good. Yeah. How's it?
How are you? Three heads and behind the background like cheering.
Hello. Yeah, I'm good. How are you? I had you guys down, but I haven't been able to watch this myself. You did more interviews. So sorry. I'll watch the recording, guys, alright? I promise. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point.
coffee. That's what's starting.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to very much is the graveyard shift, isn't it, really? Quality, not quantity. Yes, but we've got a really good panel here, a very interesting topic to discuss, actually. So we're going to be focusing on well-being in BTR, specifically the role of immunities, but also sort of widening the discussion, really, looking at what else can promote well-being. So obviously, we've talked a lot about ESG, and with the rise of that, its influence on the design and the customer offer, and the pandemic and all of the trends that threw up. So management of mental health, working from home, pets, emerging trends across other sectors. So I've got a feeling that well-being is sort of rapidly becoming kind of front and centre in a lot of people's minds at the minute. So we're going to start by defining what well-being actually is. What does it mean? How can we promote it within BTR? We'll also be challenging some of our assumptions and asking, are developers and asset owners actually doing enough right now to ensure that their amenity offering and their wider customer offer promotes well-being? And then we're going to be sort of understanding some of the reasons why it benefits all stakeholders in a building to prioritise wellness. So just to introduce myself, I'm David Tomlinson from SAY. We provide strategic operational advice to developers, asset managers, portfolio owners. And one of the areas that we're quite heavily involved in is helping new entrants into the market to define their customer offer, determine what amenity spaces and value-add services to include. We've also got a mystery shopping business called Hearsay, which focuses on the lead-to-lease journey. And we ask prospective residents all sorts of questions, one of which is about their view on amenity spaces and community initiatives that are provided. So I've got a couple of things I'll be dropping in, some findings from that research into the session. But without further ado, I'm just going to allow the panel to introduce themselves. So start with Olga.
Hello, I'm Olga Turner-Baker, I'm co-founder of ECHIST, which is the UK's first health and wellbeing consultancy for the built environment. So what that means in practice is we look at how buildings impact people's health. So whether that's from the way that the buildings are designed all the way through to the way that they're operated. And we use different tools, whether that's working with an international certification like WELL or our own tool, which is the Healthy Home Checklist.
I'm Rob, Director of Motivate. We design and install and manage community spaces, specialising in gyms and swimming pools.
Afternoon everyone, I'm Dougie Alton-Wade, I work for Native Residential and we're a build-to-rent operator. We're currently operating around 3,500 BTR units currently and another 1,500 in the pipeline.
Good afternoon everybody, my name is Kieran Tracy. I've been with Technogym for just over 14 years. We are the leading provider of wellness solutions globally. As an organisation we work in many different market segments, from hotels, corporates, to residential developments and of course traditional health clubs. But what we have at the front of our thought process is simply the consumer. Regardless of where they are, it is important about how we support them in their journeys.
Great, thanks. So, as I said, we're going to start by sort of defining wellness, looking at the kind of academic side really, and Motivate and ECHIST have very kindly provided some, very kindly provided some slides which they're going to talk through. So Kieran, you've got quite a good summary of what wellness is and this pyramid, which perhaps you could just sort of talk us through.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who know Technogym, wellness is at the heart of our brand vision and our history. We're a business that is 40 years old, and from the very beginning, our roots have been deeply associated with what wellness is to a consumer. Working out is no longer 3 times a week in the gym. Wellness is a lifestyle. And the first question I therefore ask of the audience is really to think about what is wellness and what does it mean to your consumers? How do you support those consumers within your development and your communities? When we look at it from a Technogym point of view, the automatic assumption is, of course, that Technogym is an equipment provider, And yes, that's of course a core part of our organisation and what we do. But actually, we are enhancing the lifestyle of those consumers wherever they may be, and I mentioned that there at the beginning. So think about, of course, physical exercise, the correct nutrition, and a positive mental mindset. No longer is it acceptable in the consumer's mindset to really define them as a male, 39 years old, a working professional. That very same person could, of course, have very different motivations and goals around what they want to achieve in life. So we have to dive deeper into understanding really what it is the consumer is looking for. And with that in mind, we focus on the needs and the goals of those consumers. Each of the consumer walking into an organisation for the very first time, a development, a community, will have an idea of how they want to live their life. And it's really for us as a marketplace, asset owners, operating companies, to inspire them to live a better life. And therefore, working on the concept of wellness ensures that we are supporting a better lifestyle wherever that may be. So really focusing on understanding your consumers comes from understanding what it is they do day to day. And I take myself as an example. I give you a very quick story around my personal situation. My partner, 18 months ago, was a fit and healthy 36-year-old female. She went to the gym 3 times a week. Her circumstances changed overnight when she had surgery this January. So she moved from a young, fit, healthy individual who was training 3 times a week to somebody who was looking for support and rehabilitation. That is the same 36-year-old female. So really understanding your consumers will ensure that you're able to support them in your developments.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was asked just to say a few words before we broke out into the wider panel discussion around what well-being might mean in this sector. So there's many definitions, of course, of health and well-being, but the World Health Organization paints a fairly comprehensive one. I think the main thing we have to consider is both physical and mental well-being and how that transpires into both the design and operation of the assets, and that should be what's driving your amenity decisions, looking at how that can be facilitated really. And there's a couple of points we wanted to really raise, which is it's not just about the gyms, the pools and the spas, it's also getting the design and the basics right. So you need to be thinking about things like sound as an amenity. You know, a quiet space is a form of utility for somebody. The way that you're operating that space, where you're animating it, it can be just as important as the actual physical asset that you're providing. The next point we thought would be really important to consider would be around staff well-being. So when you're thinking of amenity, don't just think about the end user, the occupant, think of staff as an end user, because ultimately staff retention rates and absenteeism is hugely decreased in healthy buildings, and you'll retain better quality staff. And EY just put out a report saying essentially people that look after their staff have 7-fold happier customers. So really important to think about those spaces, not just dark without light, because error margins massively increase when staff don't have access to light. So think about staff spaces as well. Think about the mental health facilities. You know, we work on schemes that have things like mental health first aiders on site. They really get to know their residents so that they're better placed to then provide support if that's needed. So think about that side of an amenity as well. And also events and programming. So Mason Fifth are an interesting operator we work with. You know, they look at things like even nutrition workshops. They take their residents out on little foraging workshops. You know, there's lots of animation you can do as an amenity. It doesn't have to be all singing, dancing, expensive studios and kit. You know, people often associate amenity with cost, but actually low-cost animation and activation can be just as impactful in improving well-being. And then just wanted to put up a few talking points really around, I really like this, so it's really hard to see over the shoulder, I thought I'd be up on the lectern. Harvard, our individual health really linked to the health of our buildings. So the research actually shows that buildings have a greater impact on our health than genetics. Our environment hugely shapes how our health transpires. As one doctor in a presentation recently put it, genetics essentially load the gun and your environment fires it. So we really got to think about the design of these spaces and how they're going to impact people's well-being. Unsurprisingly, being sick or creating poor quality places has a huge impact on the NHS every year. This came out from a BRE report earlier this year. And the way that they measure that, it might seem like a really big punchy stat, but they look at something called non-communicable diseases. They're essentially diseases that can be prevented through lifestyle and environmental changes. So again, if we're thinking about the design of amenities and spaces, we're thinking what preventative measures what can we put in place that's going to support people's health and hopefully take some of that pressure off the NHS. Another fact from Harvard about noise. Sometimes we really overlook the impact of quiet space as an amenity, whether that's a quiet room or whether that's acoustic insulation in between spaces. I spoke to a housing operator a few years ago who said they spend so much more money on answering nuisance calls than it would have cost them to upgrade the insulation to above building regs. So they regretted that decision straight away. So again, for anybody thinking about sound as an amenity, that's a really interesting angle, and that has a direct impact on your physiology. So we know that this happens because of the release of cortisol and other stress hormones in the body, and that's what can just push someone who may be likely to have a cardiovascular event or stress event anyway over the edge. So let's think about the basic amenities as well, like our right to light, our right to fresh air, and our right to quiet, as much as we think about those bigger ticket items. And then loneliness, that's another huge aspect you can think about when designing amenities. Let's create genuinely usable places that reduce loneliness. Constant research from London and other major cities shows that more than a quarter of us regularly feel lonely, and nearly 2/3 sometimes feel lonely. And loneliness has been attributed to being as bad for our health as smoking cigarettes. And the way that they've carried out that research is to look again on the impact on the body and the cardiovascular stress you're under when you are upset or lonely, and that has a big impact on your health as well. So think about the usability and how you're managing loneliness in the design of those spaces. And then finally, I want to touch on outdoor space. That's something people don't often value. They often employ a landscape or a biodiversity consultant just to get through planning, but they're not really thinking about how that space can be maximised or really encourage people to dwell in it and enjoy it. There was a fascinating study done in Sheffield showing that for every £1 essentially they spent on outside space, they saved about £12 onto the local healthcare system. And that was from measuring stats around things like lower uptake of taking antidepressants and lower visits to the GP. So high quality outdoor spaces really do impact the population. It's about 120 minutes a week you're advised to spend in nature to lower your likelihood of having either anxiety or depression. So yeah, just to bring that up really as a key point.
Some really, really interesting themes which it'd be good to sort of unpack as we go through the panel discussion. So just wanted to pick up on the first one, which is understanding your tenants, the profile, which you raised, Kieran. So how do developers go about this? One of the things that we found during our mystery shopping research is that only 40% of people said that they would definitely use the amenities that are on site. So are we getting it wrong? Are we not understanding our consumer properly? Maybe Rob, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting stat that 40%, because when you look at the home views, it slightly contradicts that in that a gym is the second most popular amenity after good Wi-Fi, and I think good Wi-Fi in this day and age is a given, basically. But at the same time, you can have the best amenity in the world, but unless you activate it, and unless you've got a good team on site that are encouraging its use and promoting the services within your development, whether it's a gym or a cinema or a co-working space or a shuffleboard, unless you're using those to the best of their ability, you may as well not have them. And I think we always say to our clients, unless you're going to put a gym in and then use it, or then encourage residents to use it, it's not worth doing. It's not a tick box exercise.
So Dougie, from an operator's perspective, how do you do that? How do you activate those spaces?
Well, I mean, just before I answer that question, I'll probably counter what Rob just said, because actually, and just to challenge the point, is there, your stat of 40% of people said that they would definitely use the gym. Does it matter? Because actually, when our residents are making a decision of where they want to live, that is a part of the choice. So they're comparing against other built-to-rent assets or other rental properties across the market, and it is one of the USPs. And whether they use it or not, arguably, doesn't necessarily matter. Just knowing it's there, and we had this before, but just the thought of knowing there's a gym there, arguably will impact people's well-being. So actually, that stat of 40%, one, who knows if that's true or not, and two, does it actually? I mean, are they being truthful? And two, does it really matter? I guess. What was your original question?
It was how do you go about activating those spaces? You can build them, but how do you make sure that people use them?
Yeah, I mean, and to Rob's point again, there's no point doing it if you're not going to do it properly. I think as time goes on, what we thought a gym should be, for instance, 5 years ago, is completely different now, and it's evolved completely. We activate those spaces by engaging local community, local businesses, bringing fitness instructors in, bringing people in to do mental health workshops, nutrition workshops, all of those types of things. They're really, really good for well-being. So yeah, engaging with the local community is really important. Having a really strong events calendar that's focused around wellness and education is also really, really key. And you know, I'll probably speak about this again when you come to another question. But for me, it's all about people. And I say that in pretty much every one of these talks I do. It doesn't really matter which subject it's on. It always comes back to it. And just going back to one of the things that Olga mentioned in her presentation is and one of the messages I really wanted to get across today was around the back of house spaces and what we provide for our teams on site. Because we're expecting these people that work on these sites to not only deliver what they deliver on a day-to-day from a leasing perspective, operations, maintenance, facilities, all that kind of stuff, also to engage with all of the residents on a daily basis, to have one-on-one conversations with them, activate spaces, provide events calendars, but are we focusing on them first and enabling them to be able to deliver that kind of service? And I don't think we are anywhere near that, and it's actually a rarity for us to even have an back of house office with a window in. That's quite rare, and it sounds crazy, but it is.
Yeah.
So.
And just with my cynical developer's hat on, so what are the benefits to my bottom line if I'm putting money into creating excellent back of house spaces? What are the actual benefits to me as a hard-nosed finance person?
Well, just general staff welfare. It encourages retention. It keeps people happy, which then will naturally increase your service levels and naturally increase your service scores, which then therefore will increase your service scores. We did some analysis on our home views over the last 12 months, for instance. Out of all of the reviews that we received across our portfolio, 34% of those reviews, they actually mentioned team on site and actually wrote something about the team, not just scored them, but mentioned it. That's 34%, whereas only 12% mentioned the gym and only 4% mentioned the cinema room, for instance. So it's always about the team on the site for me, and that's what keeps people in the buildings. That's how we retain people. So it's probably short-sighted, I think, to not think about that and not think about the end game. But the challenge always is proving it, and that's always been my challenge. It's trying to prove that, trying to have the argument with developers, with owners, with investors, to focus on that first, focus on your staff structure, focus on not just cutting it down so it's 5 or 6% or whatever we're trying to achieve. Actually think about the longer term game and let's work backwards. Let's look at your resident profile in 5 years. What do we want the retention to look like? What do we want churn to look like? What type of residents do you want to live here? And then kind of work backwards, because I think it's the sort of wrong way around.
Okay. So we sort of skirted around a couple of issues there, but one of the themes is sort of mental health, whether that's of staff or whether that's of residents. There's been a bit of an uptick in certain BTR operators. I can think of Moda, for example, Way of Life, who've directly partnered with mental health support providers. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about, looking at wellness holistically, not just sort of gyms and spas and what have you, but is there anything else that developers and operators should be thinking about from a mental health perspective?
Well, just one point in addition to what I've just said. I think we have to, it almost should be mandatory that every person that works on a site that is customer facing should be mental health first aid trained as an absolute minimum. I think that's where we should be. And I know there's lots of people out there doing this already and doing it well. And let's be honest, what we deliver in Build to Rent is very good. It's very, very good. But we also have so much more that we could achieve, and we've got the best platform ever and the biggest unique opportunity here to impact people's lives. And it's little simple things like that, just getting the people on site trained to be able to deliver it.
And design also affects mental health a lot. I think that's something that's quite overlooked. We know that when we use natural materials, you actually have a lower blood pressure rate. They put people in timber-clad rooms and found that their blood pressure is actually significantly lower. So again, if you, rather than perhaps doing a cinema room that might not be used, you might have a room that's specifically designed to calm senses. So whether that's through biophilic design, maybe some natural sounds, water's very calming, images of nature, that sort of thing. You could look at that, and that has a huge impact on mental health. And then the other one that's not really talked about, I think, is storage. So there's a lot of research showing a direct correlation about how much stuff you have and how stressed you are. And there's a direct relationship. And when we think of like minimum space standards, they don't really give enough space to store, you know, talk about fitness, you know, just your gym gear, your sports gear, your outdoor clothing, all of that sort of stuff. And I think BTR is better than co-living for this. Co-living is obviously quite compressed for standards, but I think storage and clutter is something that's really overlooked. And that is a direct relationship with mental health.
I think I'd go, sorry, going full circle on that and just coming back to the point Doug you made there around does it really matter whether those amenities are used. I think we have to acknowledge that consumers have choice, and when they are releasing or taking that decision to either stay or go, they have to see value in the proposition that you have, the service levels that you've given over that period of time, and ultimately the sense of community. And Rob mentioned earlier the premise of activating a space. It's all well and good having a gym facility, a cinema facility within your development, but if I don't feel a sense of community around that particular amenity, I will watch that movie in my apartment, or I will go to the gym down the road. So it does come back to this idea of people, and people of course are the employees who are engaging the residents to create those communities, but it's also getting the like-minded residents and consumers together in focus groups, in small activities in order to drive friendship. It's far easier for me to leave a development based on the number of treadmills or the weight of a dumbbell because the development next door has a bigger, better gym because it's newer. But if I build a peer-to-peer relationship with 10, 12, or maybe even 20 people within that facility, that decision's a lot harder to take.
Yeah, and I was almost going to say a very similar thing, really. It links back to Olga's point about loneliness and creating that sense of community. And workforce and actually taking the stress away from the on-site team, but still providing that service.
Great. I mean, we rapidly are running out of time. We've got lots of questions left, but one of the things that I thought it would be good to sort of pick up on is emerging trends. Like, what can we expect from the BTR sector? What emerging trends are there in other sectors that we think might be replicated in BTR? What does the future look like, essentially?
Well, I refer to probably my personal circumstances. I have 12-year-old twins, which are scarily growing up. You know, it won't be long before they're moving into perhaps a student living accommodation and then a build-to-rent scheme in 8-10 years' time. And many of these assets which are being built into the future are being designed today. You know, so really understanding the consumer of the future is important to really understanding how we attract and retain those residents within that space ultimately. And with that in mind, in my global role, I look to the US market, and what I really see there is this premise of lifestyle rather than amenities. The lifestyle in which you live within a facility, again, it comes back to the idea of communities, engagement, a sense of belonging, is an overarching strategy, a vision, and what the operating teams on site are all gearing towards, as opposed to saying we have a gym, we have a cinema. They're the fundamental activation points, but you have to really focus on activating the lifestyle of the consumer.
Interesting, you mentioned your children. I think more families will be moving into BTR as incomes stay fairly steady, but people's deposits it gets harder and harder. I think a lot more will be moving into that sector. We see a lot in the US and other areas providing really good children's amenities. I don't know if you heard of the brand Tiger Play. So they fit out spaces in like apartment schemes as like soft play essentially for kids. They're amazing quality spaces, and I think that will really attract that kind of target buyer group, definitely.
Rob, Dougie, any thoughts?
No, I mean I couldn't agree more. I mean we've seen soft play in a couple of schemes in London already, not BTR but in other tenures, and they're incredibly popular, and so I do definitely see that going one way.
I think the final thing for me really is around, we've not really talked about technology and AI, but that for me is a bit of a threat, and we don't really know the true effect of what that's going to be, and you know, we might not know that for many years to come, but I think my biggest fear and concern is that there's going to be a natural temptation to remove the human side of what we deliver and replace it with AI and technology.
From a customer service perspective.
Yeah, we're already seeing that happen, like with the, you know, as an example with the 24-hour cover, the 24-hour security service that we provide in a lot of build-to-rent buildings. You know, as costs are more challenging and things are being squeezed naturally, then staffing is generally the biggest cost, and it is the first thing that gets squeezed. So we're looking at, you know, outsourcing the sort of night provision and replacing it with either a third-party security company or technology that can provide that through cameras. But how does that affect and what impact does that have on our residents that live in the buildings that have an emergency in the middle of the night, or they just feel lonely and want to go down and speak to a human and there's nobody there? That for me is a risk, but we won't know the true impact of that just now.
So we've got 5 minutes, but open the floor to questions if anyone's got any for the panel. If not, I do have, as I said, quite a lot more. So has anyone got anything they'd like to ask? No? Okay.
I'd like to add though.
All right.
It's just one small point around pets and the impact of people having pets and how we should embrace it, and you know, the rental reform bill might force us to do that anyway, even more so. But I think we're still seeing now, even to this day, build-to-rent operators out there that are still you know, putting pets in a certain place in the building or charging extra for them, or you know, it doesn't feel inclusive even though we say it is. I'm talking as a sector here. We talk a lot about pet friendly, but there still feels like there's a lot of restrictions on the pet friendly side of things, and actually over the years I've been in BTR, there's humans have caused way more issues than pets.
Okay, so I suppose one of the themes was that there's new trends emerging. Obviously developments take a long time to come to fruition. How can developers be approaching this flexibly during the design stages? Olga, I know you've been doing some work on this with various organisations. Perhaps you want to start by...
How they can approach it? Yeah, I think it's about having it in your ESG strategy. I think it starts from day one, so having well-being in a really comprehensive way. So what does it mean from a physical perspective in your buildings? Like, what are your ventilation standards? What are your acoustic standards? What's your materiality? Are you using low VOC products? All the way through to how you plan to operate the buildings. If you don't have those conversations early on, by the time you get to RIB stage 4, it's too late. So I think, yeah, to make sure that you're really responding to all those needs, you need it in your ESG strategy, then you need it in your development briefs, and then towards the end you need to have it really written into your operational handbook, like how you're going to do all the things you've talked about. We've just brought out some guidance for the RCS, so if you want to have a look, it's called the Design, Delivery and Management of Healthy Buildings, and it's essentially a really simple step-by-step guide of just what are the basics you should be thinking about, and it's got a big resource library at the end if you want to delve further. So.
Rob, how else could developers be sort of approaching their spaces flexibly, do you think?
I mean, we've seen a lot of multi-use rooms, and I think that's really important. You know, studios are a bit like Marmite with a lot of people. They're either great or they're not great, and it goes back to the activation point. But actually, studios are a great space to have as a multi-use room. And you know, one scheme we work with, they use their studio for kids' parties. So kids can have their birthday parties in there. They've got some little tables and chairs that go in a cupboard, and they come out for weekend parties. They use them for meetings with the resident associations and things like that. So I think there are more spaces like that where you really think about what you can do, what other uses you can have for a room would be great.
And Kieran, I know you've got a large range of products, but you can also design flexibly the type of equipment that you're specifying in your spaces as well.
Absolutely, I think flexibility is key, but I'm going to counter that And the reason I counter it is based on, again, consumer insight and consumer demand. When you are working with a consumer now and you're trying to excite them, you're no longer exciting them based on physical experiences they've had, perhaps in the city they live. They're benchmarking you as an operator, as a developer, on what they see online. So if you're walking into a studio space, which is magnolia walls, a small TV screen on the wall, and it's a multifunctional space for kids' parties as well, it does serve a purpose, of course, but the average 25 to 39-year-old would rather spend £40 on the high street and go and live a really cool, innovative experience with a boutique fitness operator. So I would counter that and say, actually, do one or two things really well, rather than try and do everything for everyone.
Great, I'm just jotting this down because Brendan has left us some homework.
Yeah.
3 takeaways. So I'll take that as number 1. Has anyone else got one? Key takeaway. Dougie, perhaps?
More money.
I think
Need a bit more money in the budget, I think, to be able to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dougie's point on staff is probably the next one, really,
Staff,
to be honest, because you know, it is about the people, and you know, we can talk about the well-being of our residents, and actually, if you're not looking after the well-being of your staff, they can't look after the well-being of your residents. So I think we really need to look after the staff first.
Yeah, and get the basics right. I think we're still day-to-day not seeing developers get the basics right. So before we even think about all these amazing amenities, I think actually it's a really boring point, but it's true. Like, get some decent ventilation into these schemes, you know. Heat deaths start to occur at 23 degrees Celsius. How many of the apartments you all work on are above 23 degrees Celsius, like regularly in summer? Like, let's focus the money on getting that right, and then worry about some of this other stuff as well. Get health right.
I'd say thirdly, again, just to really embrace AI. Because I think where there is a human interaction, the human on the opposite side of that conversation or interaction sees the value. So use AI and use technology to do the heavy lifting, the meaningless tasks that your staff on site simply go, this is boring, am I doing it again, do I really need to do this? And actually use people in a good way to interact and engage with residents to ensure that they are living a happier, healthier lifestyle.
Just one example of that, just working in practice, is some of the door access systems that we use. So technology there, working with the people that work on site, so that the door access system can send a notification and trigger when, for instance, someone hasn't been active for a number of days, so 3 or 4 days, for instance. Then that does then enable the site team to go and check and just knock on the door and just check in and make sure.
Is he on holiday or is he?
Well, exactly, yeah. Those are the sorts of questions that could be prompted by AI. So.
Great. Well, with that, I think that's all we've got time for. But thanks very much to the panel.
Thank you for sticking around.
Yeah, thank you for sticking around.